Over the course of having come across the many chapters of the Sound Studies Reader, I believe it's safe to say that most of which were very trying in comprehension and readability. Though each reading having a little of something to add in completion of this book, there were points of which a chapter did not follow the previous. Though of importance to me was the seeing of sound, or in other words, synesthesia. The ability to have a mental imagery when hearing different things is completely phenomenal and of great captivation to try and understand. As a human being, to try and relate such a thing to any else would be cool to hear knowing that we all do so as people. Personally, I believe the having of some sort of mental image to hearing of sound has nothing to do with what one recalls by memory from their day-to-day lives. An article from the Georgia Review provides a story that describes a woman whose name is Franny and holds a dinner at her house in which there was no dinner served would be a great addition to the Sound Studies Reader in a new chapter. After being told that, to some extent, it was safe for her to leave her keys in the car, a familiar boy climbs into the front seat and drives off. Then the phrase, red eye, green U, blue O, is used in the article to describe the synesthesia within the mind of Franny. How I perceive the phrase, red eye, green U, blue O, must be her realizing that what just happened was very much along the lines of what her and someone else in the room had very recently discussed. A book by Richard E. Cytowic, Synesthesia, A Union of the Senses, would also be a great addition to a new chapter in the Sound Studies Reader. According to synesthesia as an unelaborated percept, a subsection within the book of Cytowic states, synesthetes do not perceive complex scenes because they share their perceptions through verbal labels. The fact that anything too complicated in imagery mentally cannot be completely shared in a verbal manner is of much fascination. Such strain reminds me of a dream, and of how when one wakes up from that dream, it is very hard to give someone in the verbal manner of explanation. In this book, synesthesia is described as comparable to explaining to a blind person what it is like to see. In my support of a proposed new reading, the auditory direction would be of the two chapters that I recommend stay in this book of the Sound Studies Reader. Talking of synesthesia drives the conversation of listening versus hearing. Though, the ability to have synesthetic reaction to a sound must be that one has listened to it. What I liked about this chapter was that it was short in text. Something that I also enjoyed about this chapter was the number of statements that I was able to agree with. For example, the description of listening as more than an intense and concentrated attention to sound and listening. And in relation to synesthesia, the statement that we suppose that there are significant contrasts between sight and sound, we approximate abstractly what the differences might be between the dimensions of sight and sound. We pair these two dimensions comparatively, what seemed to be as so, and after this chapter, upon reading more in the Sound Studies Reader, give way to numeric method of text comprehension personally. Another one of the readings that I believe should stay in the Sound Studies book would be the soundscape. I propose that this reading stay because of relation to listening versus hearing. In Chapter 2, having to do with synesthesia, in my proposed new reading for the Sound Studies Reader, this chapter discusses the blocking out of unnecessary or unwanted sounds. What was enjoyed about this chapter was my ability to reflect on it effectively. Page 95 of this chapter states that noise are the sounds that we have learned to ignore, and that noise pollution results when man does not listen carefully. Such statements are very important to the relation of how we see and perceive sound. When it comes to synesthesia, such happens with or without noise in general. This chapter is important in remembrance that sound has always been an involuntary effect on us, not only in that of synesthesia as human beings. What I did not like about this chapter was that it was very dull in repetition and described before for other chapters. It was also very much like that there was nothing at all that I could disagree with for any of these two readings, making them, in my opinion, worthy of remaining for the Sound Studies New Edition. Ancient Acoustic Spaces is a chapter that I motioned to have removed from the Sound Studies Reader in its new edition. What I liked about this chapter was its providing of information though knowledge of what an ear con is could be of much or insignificant value of information in the study of sound. The spaces around us with what we hear could not be of more importance than the understanding of those sounds. This chapter forces the perception of sound down the drain. Even the deaf can't survive without a perception of how someone or something exhibits sound. It was very enjoyable in this reading to find out that there is a why following the how we hear certain things. This chapter was very much of space filler and is of least to my liking with the readings of this chapter. Worst of the readings, I believe, is Shaping the Synthesizer. Of the sound studies reader, what I found to like of this chapter was that it was written in a very informative manner. Something to be recognized as such a reading be the description and history of the Moog processor. This reading focused on the retelling of the Moog's life, and I felt that it had such a purpose to serve in the original edition of the sound studies reader. But when it comes to the things of significant nature in this book, such a chapter has nothing to connect itself with any other aspect of sound, especially not that of synesthesia. The creation of a musical device could not even connect to the reading of earcon, and the why of how we hear things in most cases. This chapter would not be at the bottom of my list if so. Reading this chapter felt as a major turn of sequential importance with the reading of the original addition to the sound studies reader. Veering a topic from perception to the playing of sound and how both is dealt with socially is very confusing and nothing relatable in similarity of what is of physical matter to what is beneath another human's surface. Of all the chapters given in the original version of the Sound Studies Reader, I have proposed those of which I agree should stay and those of which should go. When speaking of synesthesia, there are things of those should be more spoken that should be of more focus on the mind's perception of sound. Most chapters in the original text of the Sound Studies Reader provided a good deal of information, but still in most cases were either hit or miss in relevance to what came before. With proposed reading by Saitowick, there are real-life examples that are given. My proposed new reading will be of greater clarification to readers of which are to study synesthesia. The reading on instruments such as the synthesizer were of no use of the original text with the Sound Studies Reader. A study of an instrument is very informative but of no relation to study that is along the lines of the sounds of one's body. A chapter as such, including the chapter on acoustic spaces, disengages the book from having to do with real-life situations to be understood in relation with sound. All in all, the original publication of the Sound Studies Reader was not at all that great, and I hope that it is taken with much consideration that there be implementation of my new proposed reading, not only for greater comprehension of what needs to be discussed in the original publication. A new edition of the Sound Studies Reader should be made of engaging study and not of redundancy of what should be the focus of generality. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Joshua Ford, and I'm here to discuss what should be added, what should be kept, and what should be deleted from the Sound Studies Reader's second edition. My first thing I would like to add is an article called Musical Influences in Advertisement, How Music Modifies First Impressions of Product Endorsers and Brands. Now, I got interested in this topic because after reading the Sound Studies Reader, hearing how sound's all around us, the closest thing that really came to like media, in a sense, to me when reading was the radio. And I happened to be sitting in front of a TV listening to an advertisement which happened to be playing one of the songs I like. It had Hall of Fame. And it caught my attention how I was like, wait, why do they do that? And why would they put music that people like into ads instead of using the old jingles? So I looked it up and I figured out that someone did a research on this where they took 132 subjects and they listened to one of 3 versions of a radio commercial. Each one of them was different. It had a different tone, different pitch, and different tempo. They all matched the ad, but they all had different ways of playing it. And they concluded that depending on the musical style, Music can lead to significantly different impressions of the endorser as well as the brand without affecting general evaluations of the product. So I brought an example for you to hear. There it is.
Touch a guy, don't bang it on his door. You can throw your hands up, you can beat the clock. You can move a mountain, you can break rocks. You can be a master, don't wait for luck. Dedicate yourself and you can find yourself. Standing in the Hall of Fame. And the world's gonna know your name. And you'll be in the walls in the Hall of Fame. Be a champion on the walls in the Hall of Fame.
So that was my example, and as you can see, it's not too complicated. They simply just matched a song that is similar to the product, like the school there was like showing how you can get success. You play Hall of Fame with it, and boom, you have yourself a product that people love. Now I move on to what I keep. Earlier I mentioned how the radio was closest to the thing that it came to media, and it just happens, I love this chapter, because not only does it talk about sound, it kind of implements how the radio's sound changed culture entirely. It played it, and then you had jazz that came. People could listen to it in their homes instead of having to go to concerts. They didn't have to worry about crowds or anything. It just changed society. You could hear news across the nation, and it explained how, instead of being complex, going places, paying money, you just relax at your home. It explains how radio's changed life, and I think that's important to have in the sound studies reader because it both shows history and the culture change of what happened. And I also believe that the soundscape should be kept. And I found this perfect picture which kind of shows what the book is about, how we are surrounded by noise, how we kind of create noise pollution in our world. You have trains, got planes, got cars, got horns, and the person is like, ah! So I found out that, I wanted to keep this because unlike the other two, it kind of explains how it's like, it sounds not bad, but control it. Don't make it so that it bothers people, it hurts you. You want it to keep your eyes open to this pollution, because people no longer appreciate sounds really what it's saying. It doesn't mean that everyone doesn't appreciate it. It just means that most people don't appreciate it. I know I didn't really appreciate it until I read this chapter and realized of all the noises that I really heard. And it's just bringing awareness to you. So I thought it'd be a great thing to keep in the Sound Studies Reader 2nd edition. The Walkman effect. Delete. Delete! Yep, got me. So it's more of a technological read, as one of my colleagues said earlier. And it's not really about sound that much. Also, it was kind of difficult for me to read. It took me about 3 times to understand what it meant. And even when I came to class, I still didn't understand until my group told me what it meant. I still don't know what it means. Apparently it's about portable sound, but I really didn't like this chapter too much, too difficult to read. I would just say get rid of it if you don't understand. The next one I want to delete is fidelity versus intelligibility. It's complex, difficult, didn't enjoy it. It talks about the 2 modes of listening, phonographic and telephonic. There were some cool parts to the reading, like how theaters would implement the sound in it, but it's just overall I couldn't understand it. And to prove it, I have one sentence for you, one sentence out of this chapter. According to the principle of narrative priority, dialogue recording tends almost uniformly from the early 30s on toward the telephonic, minimizing the amount of reverberation, background noise, and speech idiosyncrasy, while simultaneously maximizing the directness of frontality of recording the intelligibility of the dialogue. What? what? I don't understand. So, and that's what most of the chapter really is to me when I read that. So I just overall say, if you don't understand it, might as well just bring in new stuff that you can understand, or just simplify it. In conclusion, I believe the second edition of the Sound Studies reader should bring awareness to surroundings, like show what's around you, maybe talk about how sound is implemented in life. We'll also talk about how it should be kept and how it should be maintained so that you do not pollute your lives, but also enjoy the sound that is around you. Thank you.
Okay, so my name is Laura, and today I'll be talking about the Sound Studies Reader, 2nd edition. So to begin with, I think the first edition was a very insightful book. It had pretty much everything covered from history all the way to physics, but while reading through the book I noticed that there isn't a lot of things actually covered in natural sciences. And with that being said, I propose a new reading called Long-Term Music Listening Effect on Blood Pressure, Heart Rate, Anxiety, and Depression by Tanhan Bell and David Akombo to be added to the next edition of the book. So nowadays music is a really big part of our everyday life. When you go shopping, it's always playing in the background. People like just listening to it, studying, reading, working, driving in and out of work. But when you think about it, most individuals, we don't really think about the effect the music actually has on our body, especially on our well-being. And this chapter talks exactly about that. So this reading talks about a study done on 217 adults. All of them were divided to pretty much equal 4 groups, and each group were asked to listen to a specific genre of music. The study has shown that, the results have shown that music's listening, especially relaxing music listening, has a really tremendous effect on blood pressure, heart rate, and with improving anxiety and depression levels. Relaxing music evokes positive emotions and impacts cognitive functions by releasing neurotransmitters and other chemicals to the body, so it elevates mood and reduces anxiety. Also, one of the main reasons why I think this should be added to the next edition of the book, because it really highly focuses on how this could be used in our daily life and raises awareness that such a simple thing as music actually has a very big impact on our life. And it gives examples on how this has already been used, such as music therapy like that has been used for centuries now in hospitals to treat patients, to reduce their anxiety and stress levels before going into surgery, as well as reduce depression in mentally ill individuals and help people with speech pathologies. Also why I like this chapter, because it also gives a lot of suggestions. For example, for college students, it says that listening to music would help to reduce stress and anxiety, for example, before oral presentations like this, or exams. So overall, I think that this would be a great chapter and a great addition to the next edition of the book, since it raises a lot of awareness. But in order to add something new, I think we should also consider removing a few things, and one of them, I believe, could be Reading the Sonoric Landscape by Richard Leppard. Although the author does give a really good example on how to read the sonoric landscape, I will admit that this was one of my least favorite chapters in the book, mainly because on the way it was written. So chapters in the introductory book, they should be difficult to challenge the reader, but I don't think they should be too difficult to discourage the reader to continue to read the chapter, or just in general pursue interest in this field, and unfortunately this chapter does exactly that. It was really hard to read it and understand it. I kept losing my point. I had to reread it a lot of times to finally get what it means, so it's just really difficult to concentrate on it. Other thing that I think it should be removed is because I don't think it fits the overall theme of the book. While it does talk about sound, the sound is imaginary, and I just think it really detaches itself from the book and it prevents it from flowing as smooth as it could without this chapter in it. Next chapter that I think could be removed from the next edition is Following You, Disciplines of Listening in Social Media by Kate Crawford. I will admit this was one of my favorites actually in the book, but I think it should be removed because just like the last chapter I talked about, it doesn't really fit the overall theme of the book. While it does concentrate about sound, it mainly talks about how reading posts online is equivalent to listening to people express their thoughts. And while I do agree with that, the sound again is imaginary and not a real sound. So it really doesn't fit into the book, even though I liked it, and as hard as for me to say it, I think it should be removed from the next edition of the book. So how there is some bad chapters, I also think there's a few really good ones that definitely deserve a chance to stay. And one of them is The Soundscape by Murray Schafer. This chapter, just like my mentioned first chapter that I think should be added, it raises awareness to the reader about the sound surrounding us and why we should try and save the silent places in the world. This chapter gives a great introduction about sound and noise pollution. It was really easy to read and understand it. I didn't have to read it a lot of times. And I think these are all great qualities that describes a chapter that should definitely stay in the next edition of the book. And one more chapter that I think should definitely stay is Laughing Machines by Jacob Smith. Just like the chapter about social media, this was one of my favorite ones. Even though it highly focuses on the history, it was very interesting and gives a great background about laughing machines, how they were introduced, how they were and still are used in TV shows. This chapter talks about mixed feelings laughing machines gave to the readers and to the viewers, and this encourages the reader to think about ethical problems as well as raises awareness how differently people interpret sound and its purpose on TV. But overall, I think that this chapter was very interesting and easy to follow. It gave a great description and definitely inspired me to look more into it. So to conclude, I believe that adding long-term music's effect on blood pressure, heart rate, anxiety, and depression, as well as removing reading the sonoric landscape, Following You, Disciplines of Listening in Social Media, and keeping the soundscape and laughing machines will really contribute to the better next edition of the book and it would make it the best version it could be. Thank you.
So hi all, today I'm going to talk to you about my proposal for changes which should be made for a second edition of Jonathan Stern's Sound Study Reader. So we're all college students, so just by a quick show of hands, who has experienced like being annoyed by loud noises from outside your dorm and not being able to sleep and etc. So this is basically noise pollution, and so I would like to propose this topic as an addition to the Sound Studies Reader. So the article I'm proposing was published in 2017 by New York Times titled New York, the City That Never Shuts Up by Winnie Hu. This article provides the audience with a concise evaluation on noise pollution in New York City, the causes of noise pollution and the effect it can have on society. So in the article, it explains that in 2011 New York Times tested noise levels in various locations within New York and found that the recorded noise, like decibels, was dangerously high for the human ear. And then so 5 years later after the testing, the problems only become worse, with noise is the number one complaint among residents of New York City, with approximately 420,000 noise complaints reported in 2016 alone, double that was reported in 2011. The article also discusses the health effects of noise pollution, such as high levels of stress, hypertension, and like even down the road heart disease and effects on your immune system. So the main causes of noise pollution include loud noises like loud music and parties, banging and pounding noises, loud talking, loud televisions, and this is responsible for about 80% of noise complaints. I believe this article would be suitable for the Sound Studies Reader as noise pollution its causes and effects are very relevant to today's society. It's a big problem, especially in a rapidly growing population in big cities. So therefore, the topic of this reading would be relevant to a lot of people, pretty much anywhere. So also the readability of this text is very high standard. The text only contains very small amounts of complicated vocabulary, and also discusses only a limited amount of topic-specific concepts. It's quite broad and to the public. So the article also uses quotes from reputable sources and residents from New York City, which I feel increases the reliability and readability of the source. So for this reason, I feel like this would be an appropriate addition to the Sound Studies reader. So with this addition, some chapters should be removed from the reader to keep a consistent and relative size of the reader. So the first chapter, which I think should be removed, is Contradicting Media Toward a Political Phenomenology of Listening by Jody Berlin. This writing is really academic. It discusses some complex political and economic themes within the radio. It talks about radio's existence sort of through the evolution of television. Talks about the history of American and Canadian radio and the privatization of American radio. Although these topics are very sort of interesting and somewhat relevant to sound studies, the text contains a lot of jargon and complicated vocabulary. It's also got some personal bias against Canadian radio and American radio and stuff. So I feel like the Berlin goes off on lots of tangents, which are somewhat irrelevant to a large portion of the audience. So for these reasons, I suggest that this should be removed from the book, from the reader. The second chapter, which I think should be removed, is Reading the Sonoric Landscape by Richard Leppert. This chapter defines the concept of sonoric landscape and discusses subtopics such as the notability of sonoric meaning, sound and the social order, contemplation and the body, and music and differences. Although this idea of sonoric landscape is sort of relevant to the topic of sound studies, the article goes on tangents which would be sort of irrelevant to most people. The readability of the chapter is also extremely low. It's got lots of difficult language, complicated sort of philosophical concepts, and it just doesn't really engage the reader much. It took a lot of concentration to read, which I feel like for an introductory textbook isn't really suitable. So therefore I suggest it should be removed from a second edition of the reader. So to accompany the addition of my proposed reading, I recommend that there's two chapters that should be carried over for the second edition of the textbook. The first is The Auditory Dimensions by Don Ide. This chapter compares the similarities and differences and overlapping traits of the sight and sound dimensions. The chapter also explores the limits of the sight and sound dimensions, suggesting invisibility is the horizon of sight and silence is the horizon of sound. These potentially confusing concepts are explained quite straightforward and understandably. He uses lots of real-life analogies and graphs and diagrams and stuff, which I found increased the readability and helped it sort of flow and made it easy to understand. The topics that he discusses are also quite relevant to the book, and I feel like is a good introduction and sort of pathway into the reading about noise pollution, which I suggested should be added. So for these reasons, I think it should be carried over into the next edition of the reader. So the second chapter which I think should be carried over is Michelle Martin's Gender and Early Telephone Culture. This chapter explores topics such as the evolution of telephone culture, the role of gender in the development of early telephone culture, the sense of privacy and intimacy which the telephone creates. These topics are explored with a really good level of readability, comprehensible language. It's got subheadings through it. It's got simple graphs, and it just sort of makes all of that makes it easy to understand, and it flows quite well. So it's really readable. Similar to my suggested article on noise pollution, this chapter also uses quotes and sort of colloquial language throughout, which increases readability and just makes it sort of enjoyable and broadens the audience of the chapter and the book. Although this topic does not entirely interconnect with noise pollution, the general theme of being a readable text and the general ideas discussed are quite related to sound, and I feel are relevant to a wider audience. So for these reasons, I think it should be carried over into the second edition. So to recap, the changes which I recommend should be made is removing the chapter contradicting media to a political phenomenology of listening and reading the sonoric landscape. The chapters which should then be replaced with these chapters should then be replaced by New York, the City That Never Shuts Up by Winnie Hu. And then to complement the edition of this article, the carrying over of the chapters, the auditory dimension and gender and early telephone culture should be carried over into the second edition. I recommend these changes to be made because it would add more relevant content and increase the readability of the sound studies reader, which are both very important things for growing the size of the book's audience. So to conclude, I hope you consider my proposed changes for the second edition of the Sound Studies Reader by Jonathan Stern.